Okay, well, The Long Walk doesn't make the best use of its very striking premise, but I think the worst problem is what seems to be its message, which I think is the wrong one at maybe the worst possible time. I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. The IMDb synopsis for The Long Walk reads, "A group of teenage boys compete in an annual contest known as The Long Walk, where they must maintain a certain walking speed or get shot." I don't usually talk spoilers, but I'm going to save them for the end. You'll get plenty of warning. But to talk about the thematic stuff, I got to get into spoilers at some point. But let me just give you my overview of my thoughts on the movie as a story experience, I guess. This takes place in this dystopian, I think, alternate history. It feels like the 70s or 80s. After some major war, American society has changed. We learn a few details of how it's changed as the movie advances. Citizens have lost some significant rights, and the military seems to be a major power. I don't know if the military actually rules or not, but they seem very much a significant power on behalf of the government. Mark Hamill plays the Major, and it's unclear to me how powerful he is in the government structure. He seems to have more authority than to merely run this competition, but he's still just called a major, not a general or admiral, or certainly not the president. And that's really important to my problems with the message at the end of the movie, which I'll give spoiler warnings before I talk about. There is, I think, a clear sort of main character, but also a strong secondary character, and then an ensemble cast. Yes, it's a lot of walking. That's what you're watching, a lot of walking. But a lot of it is very character-driven sort of conversation. And tension is built as boys are falling behind and they risk or meet their terrible end. However, that tension remained largely weak for me because the striking premise is not fleshed out with an understanding of the world that makes sense of the decision each of these boys has made to voluntarily participate in this situation. I want to understand what has driven them really to be here so I can not feel like they're being foolish. In some ways, it's got a similar structure to Saving Private Ryan in that a group of young men willingly head into a horribly deadly situation, starting out with tough talk, bickering, and wisecracking amongst themselves, but then dissolving ultimately into unsettling whimpers as they reach their end in a state of weakness and desperate fear. But with one exception, they are not volunteering because a world power is like, well, with no exception, actually. They're not volunteering because a world power is swallowing and subjugating nation after nation, as was the case in World War II. One of them, the main character, I think has a different motivation. We start to understand that deeper into the movie. But like the rest of them, I'm like, this is not World War II. They're volunteering because they want to get out of economic hardship that broadly America is experiencing in this world. Now, how hard that economic hardship is for each of them, we are never clearly told. And so any understanding of how desperate or fearful they may have been leading to their volunteering, motivating them, I'm left to wonder about. But they don't show up, at least, as though they are at the end of their rope and the lives of their family members depend on them. They largely show up a little bit like they signed up for a game show. Yet they know in this game only one will survive and the rest will be shot dead. If they really signed up, each thinking they were like a shoo-in and highly likely to win, like so much so that they don't have anything to worry about, that makes them foolish. If they thought there was even a 50-50 chance of them dying, and they and their families are not already literally at death's door because of financial struggles, that also makes them seem foolish to me, or for recklessly risking their lives for a chance at a prize they don't actually need that badly. So I needed to understand why they were subjecting themselves to this risk, because otherwise I'm just like, these guys are idiots. The particulars of character backgrounds are largely unexplored, and so to me, most of them seemed foolish, like teenagers or bumbling adults in a slasher movie or monster movie who, in our minds, almost deserve what they get for being so stupid. You know that kind of horror movie if you've seen horror movies before. And that was kind of what, it's not a horror movie, but that's kind of what I felt like. I felt like I was watching a horror movie with a bunch of dumb protagonists. And horror to me works best when they do everything they can that's smart to avoid dying, and they still get killed, because then, oh my gosh, the threat is so much more dangerous, and I am invested in them. I'm seeing myself more in their circumstances, and I'm just not connecting with these characters, their motives, why they're in those circumstances, and so that takes a lot of the tension out for me. Even the backstory of the main two characters is rarely filled in at all. If it was 5 to 10 contestants instead of 10, and the movie had regular flashbacks helping me get to know each of them and why they decided to volunteer, this might have been a dramatically powerful and suspenseful movie for me, but it just didn't do that. Another option would be to make it into like a mini-series that had like 8 episodes, that you have 50 characters, maybe, but there's time in a stretch of 6 to 8 episodes to really get into their backstories a whole lot more. So while it wasn't without suspense or impact for me, it felt so far short of what it could have been, I think. And given the structure of the movie and who was given focus, I felt like I had it pretty narrowed down in my mind who was going to survive, so that the final reveal of that wasn't a big shock, and how it was handled and the note the movie ends on was sad to me, because I think I was supposed to find it satisfying, as one clapping member of my theater audience clearly did. And that bummed me out that they were clapping at the ending that we were given. And for reasons I'll share at the end when I get into spoilers, that had me walking out of the theater very haunted and sad about where we are at in this moment in American society. As far as the cast goes, the cast all felt great. I was never taken out thinking about actors making choices and that kind of stuff. These performers did a great job of at least portraying their personality types, the different emotions. It gave me all the more reason to want to know more about their backgrounds and motives, because I felt like they had a richness of their own character's backstory in their minds because of their performances. So really solid across every role. I have no complaints. Well done. As far as visual stunts, that kind of stuff, it's mostly practical. Obviously, there's some digital work when they actually show characters being shot in the head. But in part, I know that, they were using digital stuff there because these actors clearly didn't die. We didn't hear about that in the news. And so those effects were pretty solid, though not perfect. Otherwise, it's not a visual effects movie. So, I think the trailers would tell you that much, too. Okay. So before I get into spoilers to talk about what seems to be the terrible, even harmful message of this movie, I'll wrap up my main thoughts by saying, if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time, tell Pater, skip. It falls way short of the potential of its premise despite great performances, and the message will probably just leave you in a funk for the rest of the day. That said, if other people start talking about it, especially if they love it, maybe see it so you can engage in what might be a very important conversation to have with them. This one's rated R for strong, bloody violence, grisly images, suicide, pervasive language, and sexual references. Before I get to spoilers and the theme, I also want to thank the $10 patrons for this month. Normally I do that with a monthly goofy song, but I hope you understand. My heart is just too heavy to make a silly song a part of this content. Even so, I am extremely grateful for the patrons at the $10 tier this month. That includes Dan XL, Gabriel Stinson, Olin D. Branham, Winston Crutchfield, Lee Bray, Joel Nelson, Jake Berry, John Wilkerson, and Daryl Nawu. Guys, thank you very, very much for your support. Okay, if you're listening to the podcast, jump to the next timestamp if you don't want spoilers. If you're watching the video version, stop watching now to avoid spoilers, but please assume that you may find them in the comments, as I want to be able to freely discuss the ending down there if anyone wants to discuss it with me. Okay, here we go. The script telegraphs that it will be either Garrity or McVrees who will survive. Garrity wants to use the wish granted to the victor to ask for a nearby soldier's gun so he can assassinate the major, who we learn in a flashback also killed Garrity's dad, who for sharing censored literature like Kierkegaard and Mark Twain with his son. What's his first name? I can't remember. They were calling each other by their last names. But anyway, so that's what he was killed for not long, it seems, before this competition. And he privately shares this goal with McVrees, who urges him not to do that if he wins, saying vengeance isn't enough. And he should go home to his mom, who is shattered that her son volunteered to do this competition. McVrees is portrayed as a noble, loving character throughout the movie, seeing Garrity as a brother by the end. He even tries to sacrifice his life so Garrity can survive, since McVrees seems to have no family to go home to and doesn't want the prize that badly. Garrity stops him and convinces him to keep walking when it's just down to those two, only to subtly, after that, stop walking himself, voluntarily dying so McVrees can survive and win the prize. Before dying, he tells McVrees that he doesn't have it in him to see the light that McVrees sees, to have that perspective that McVrees wants him to have. So he wants the noble McVrees to live and presumably make the world better by the example he showed to Garrity, that Garrity found so inspiring that he chose to sacrifice his life so McVrees could live out those values. But then, McVrees is so distraught by the murder of Garrity that he uses Garrity's idea to request a gun. And then in a moment of tension in which the Major looks like he's going to survive, and of course, giving us every reason again in that moment to be worthy of our hate as a character, McVrees gives in to his intense emotion and kills the Major, then walks away by himself. This is the moment that I heard applause in the theater. It's just one person, but I was kind of dumbfounded and sobered by that. As far as a plot point, why is McVrees not gunned down by the other soldiers nearby? No idea. I have every reason to think that killing the Major will not change this world. It won't get rid of this competition or much anything else of substance. Mark Hamill, again, is presented as just a major in rank. Let me know, please, if I missed something, like a line saying the Major has replaced the President, Congress, and Supreme Court, that he is basically Hitler. It's possible, but we just don't get information about the government structure and who Mark Hamill is in it. He is the strongest representation of authority that is from the government. But I mean, I don't have a reason to specifically think that he is Hitler over America now. He's charismatic, clearly an influential public figure. He does seem to have authority to carry out punishment upon the guilty upon capture if he decides to. But that seems to me like it would still be delegated to him from higher authorities. Is the Major in this movie the highest power that makes this dystopia what it is? They never said that he is, that I noticed. I think I was paying attention. Maybe I missed something. If I am, please let me know. But from what I saw in this movie, killing the Major is no solution for the country. And I don't even think it's the motive at the end when it happens. Remember, each of these young men volunteered to be in this competition. I think that needs to be stated a few times. They do weakly, in the first half of the movie at some point, try to suggest that because every teenage boy in America volunteers for this, that just is kind of a phenomenon. Hey, have you ever noticed everybody volunteers? That it's not a real choice, but none of them say, hey, it's not that, like, that's not a sneaky, it doesn't seem to be a sneaky way of saying, hey, every boy in America volunteers, quote unquote. No, they're saying, hey, every boy in America volunteers. And because of that, somehow, it's kind of said to be, it's not really a choice then, is it? What does that even mean? Does that mean that we lose our power to choose when everyone else is making the same choice? That because of cultural movement, we lose our power to choose and we're just swept along in the culture? Does no one in this world of this movie remember the basic, if your friends all jumped off a cliff, nugget of wisdom? They don't establish, near enough about like what point they're making, why it's not a real choice. So in my mind, participants, they're not prisoners of an evil regime. Yes, rights have been removed, but nobody is forced to be in this competition. I'm not even sure how dire their financial circumstances are. So that it maybe arguably would feel like, well, it's not a choice because if they don't do this, their family will die. That point is never made. Yes, there are financial struggles that everyone in America is experiencing, and these guys volunteer to be a part of this for a chance at getting out of that struggle. But it's not portrayed as like oh my gosh, they are so poor, so destitute, that if they don't do this, their families will die. Like I said earlier, that's not the tone with which they enter this competition. They volunteered, and even in McVree's own words, he doesn't want the prize that badly. Now, yes, Mark Hamill's the Major is a horrible human being with no regard for human life. He's disgusting. If he was a real person, I would regularly wish for him to shut up and disappear from the public eye and from having influence. But even if he did shut up and disappear, someone else would likely take his place. I don't know why not in the world presented in this movie. So based on the info this movie gave me, killing the Major is not a solution in the sense that, say, killing Hitler was part of a solution in World War II. I'd see the more helpful path to be that of pleading with everyone in this world not to participate. And I would sadly mourn the foolishness of those boys who bring death upon themselves and tragedy to their families by willingly choosing to be a part of this competition. The sense of personal responsibility it seems like it's attempted to be removed from these boys, but it's so weakly executed on that I just don't even see it. And then I have to ask, okay, what happened to the light in McVries that looked like it would lead him to make a choice more like the one of trying to influence change rather than killing this guy? What happened to that light that Garrity saw in him? Well, McVries' grief, anger, and rage, understandably, I want to be sympathetic toward this character in saying understandably his grief, anger, and rage led him to join the Major in devaluing human life to the point of murder. It didn't seem to be a tactical decision that he was making at the end of this movie. That like killing the Major, this tactically will get rid of this competition, it'll change the world for the better. It was not a tactical decision that he was making in that moment. He was overcome by grief, anger, and rage. And it caused him in that moment to devalue the life of the Major to the point of murder. And so in all of this, I mean, it should be obvious to us that this can't be the path we take as Christians. To even hate someone else, Jesus said, is the same as committing murder in our hearts. Hate is this devaluing of another human, and it's the core issue that leads to murder. The timing couldn't be much worse for the kind of itch this movie seemingly wants to encourage me to scratch. You know, seeing our political opponents as worthy of our hate, and then feeling satisfied when that horrible person of a totally different ideology that I think is terribly harmful, you know, seeing them as worthy of snuffing out. As I record this review, it's been just 2 days since the public murder of Charlie Kirk, an outspoken commentator on moral and political issues. At least that is my very limited understanding of him. YouTube, the algorithm, seems to think that I want to watch his stuff. It keeps giving me thumbnails. Charlie Kirk, Charlie Kirk, Charlie... I've barely watched any of it. So I'm not reflecting on his murder as someone who was like a fan or something. But what I am reflecting on is the fact that he was a public voice representing some views that many people hate. I don't know the heart of the person who murdered him, but it seems likely they were someone who hated him and perhaps especially the views he expressed, or maybe also hated how he expressed them. I don't know. But Kirk was a contentious public figure. And I think there is not insignificant potential for the ending of The Long Walk to stoke the flames of hate that people have for public figures they strongly disagree with, or perhaps blame for certain societal ills. I'm not suggesting The Long Walk will play a role in anyone's assassination or murder. I want to be clear on that. But I think it does potentially encourage the mindset that devalues the lives of those we strongly disagree with. The mindset that would maybe even at least wish harm on them, instead of desiring a change of their heart and their mind. Now, it's possible, looking at this movie, based on some vague hints, that in the world of The Long Walk, free speech is limited. So maybe there would be some difficulty in speaking out about the Long Walk competition. That's not super clear to me. But here today in America, we have the freedom to speak. And if enough Christians learn to do that with both clarity and very personal, genuine warmth and compassion for each individual we interact with of opposing viewpoints, it won't be seen as a very viable solution to kill and silence one or a few. If there's a movement of Christians that are not only speaking truth, but doing it from a place of compassion, and I'm not even talking about doing this as public figures. It's easy to watch public figures and get fired up by them positively or negatively, getting more ingrained in our views, and yet not having practice in healthy conversation with people in our real day-to-day lives. It's become largely this weird spectator sport, I think, where we watch the few engage in public, and it's a bit of a show to see how contentious they get, and we either keep our mouths shut in our social situations are like real day-to-day social relationships and stuff where there would be maybe an opportunity to talk with someone about something that we disagree on. So we either keep our mouths shut, but stew in our feelings, or we make a big mess in our personal social situations because we're all passion and no love or wisdom. 2 Timothy 2:23 through 26 in the ESV says, "Have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach." And by the way, that doesn't mean able to speak truth. Lots of people can say things that are true. Teaching is helping someone learn. Able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. Yes, we can certainly look at certain people saying certain things as being used by the devil, but that doesn't mean that we should lose compassion for them. They are not our enemy. They're being used perhaps by the enemy, but our longing should be, along with Paul's, along with the Holy Spirit, that they come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil that they are in, that is causing them to be captured to do his will. Yes, their will is involved in that. Their choices are, it's not all on the devil, but there is that sense also in which we need to recognize they have become captive. But they may come to their senses. Maybe we can be a part of that. That's the longing of the Holy Spirit in those words in 2 Timothy 2:23 through 26. Then in Titus chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, "Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works. And in your teaching, show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us." We can tend to focus on truth and neglect love, or on love and neglect truth, but we are called to bring to bear completeness of both. As Christians, we should be learning to speak truth in such a way that nothing about the way we speak truth can be criticized. There's nothing evil that can be said about our tone, about what our attitude seems to be. Nothing evil can be said about that. They may find the gospel or the truth of Scripture offensive, but sometimes we can assume that's what they're finding offensive, and actually it has something to do with how we are coming across, where our hearts are at, and how that's on display in an unfortunate way in the way we're interacting with them. What should be the case is that it's so obvious to our opponents that we care about them individually that at most, the worst they can conclude about us is that we are wrong in our thinking or delusional or whatever, but they would have no grounds in their mind to even suspect that we are callous and uncaring toward them and their difficulties, because as we talk about these issues with them, we have hearts of compassion. We recognize that there's hurt there. No one is angry without some hidden pain. No one is cruel without some deep felt need that they are trying to meet with their cruelty. And in remembering that, we can keep conversation viable and even fruitful. I hope that Charlie Kirk's most fierce opponents all understand that, or come to understand that. But for those of us who perhaps lean more to the right politically than we do to the left, we also need to model this the next time some talking head of the other viewpoint makes us fiercely angry. At this intensely combative time in American discourse, I think The Long Walk sends out the wrong message at maybe the worst possible time. But we can choose to live out a different one. And as Christians, that's not only possible, it's our calling and responsibility. All right, that's all for me, guys. Thank you. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.